After building my dream from scratch, I never imagined the people closest to me, my husband and his brother, would try to tear it all down. But when they secretly conspired to steal my business, they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated me. What they thought would be a smooth takeover became their worst nightmare, as I turned their betrayal into a game they could never win. This is the shocking story of how I outsmarted the people I loved and saved everything they tried to destroy. My name is Allison Reed. I'm 38 years old and the proud owner of Reed Designs, a thriving interior design business I built from the ground up. It started small, just me working late nights, designing for local clients, and trying to get my name out there. Over the years, I turned that dream into a business that not only supported me, but also employed a talented team of people I trusted. The business had grown into something I was incredibly proud of, and every decision I made, every project I took on, was a reflection of my vision. I knew every detail of my company, from the color schemes we used in our designs to the financials that kept us afloat. I had worked tirelessly for the past 10 years, and now we were one of the top design firms in the city. It was everything I'd ever wanted and more. At home, things were supposed to be just as perfect. I had a loving husband, James, who had always been my biggest supporter. We'd been together since college, and although he had his own career, he was always there to encourage me when I doubted myself. His brother Michael had always been around too, although his role in my life was more peripheral. He worked in sales, nothing too serious, but he was always willing to lend a hand if we needed a little extra help with anything. But everything changed one evening. It wasn't anything obvious at first. The changes came slowly, like the tide creeping up a beach. James had been acting a little off, quieter, more distant. At first, I thought it was just stress from his job, but when he started asking more about the business, about things I had never discussed with him, like our client contracts and the upcoming projects, I brushed it off. We had always kept a good balance between work and home life, but as time went on, the questions became more probing. James would mention that he had some ideas about how I could expand the business or how things could be done differently. At first, I entertained these suggestions, thinking they were just his way of showing interest in what I'd built. And then, one day, Michael showed up unexpectedly at the office. He came in wearing his usual casual clothes, looking far too comfortable for someone who had no real role in the company. He asked me about some internal processes and how we could streamline the way things were done. I tried to be polite, but something about the way he was pushing made me uneasy. It felt less like genuine interest and more like an agenda. "Allison," he said with that all too familiar grin, "I think you could really use a fresh set of eyes around here. You've done well, but things are moving fast in the design world. We could help you scale up." The way he said it, like it was an inevitability, left me with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I didn't need his help scaling up. I had built this business with my own hands, made every decision that led us here. Michael had no experience in design, no understanding of the intricacies of my work, yet here he was, acting like he could suddenly see ways to improve things. I smiled and nodded, trying to keep the peace. After all, he was family. But in the back of my mind, I started to wonder if there was more to this than just casual advice. It wasn't long before I found out that I was right. James came to me that night, looking unusually nervous. He sat down on the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. "Allison," he said slowly, "I think it's time we talked about the future of Reed Designs. I've been thinking, Michael and I have been talking. We think it's time you brought someone else in to handle things, maybe a more business-minded person to take over some of the day-to-day." I stared at him in disbelief. "Take over?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. James, I've spent the last 10 years building this company. What do you mean, take over? What about me? He avoided my gaze, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. You've done great, but it's time for a new direction. We could bring in someone with more experience in managing large-scale businesses. Maybe Michael could step in and help out with some of the bigger decisions. I think he has a lot of good ideas. I felt the ground beneath me start to shake. My husband and his brother, both of whom had no experience in running a design firm, were talking about taking control of my life's work. I couldn't believe it. I had built Reed Designs from nothing, fought for every client, earned every penny. And now they were suggesting I step aside for someone who had never even understood what it meant to make this business thrive. James, you can't be serious, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though the hurt was palpable. You're telling me you want to replace me? Replace me with Michael? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me with that same uncomfortable expression. I just think it's time for a change, Allison. Maybe it's better for the company in the long run. The words stung. They felt like a betrayal, a complete disregard for everything I had done. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. I wasn't going to sit idly by and let them take what I had worked so hard for. But I wasn't about to make any rash decisions either. I needed to think this through, to figure out what was really happening here. So I told James I needed some space to think. I walked away, my heart racing with 1,000 thoughts. Was this really happening? Were they really trying to steal my business from under me? The answer came sooner than I expected. And when I realized what they were truly planning, I knew I had to take action. The next few days were a blur. James and Michael's plan, although not explicitly stated, seemed clearer with each passing moment. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was overreacting, that I was just being paranoid. After all, they were family. But the more I thought about it, the more it became evident that their actions weren't driven by concern for the business. They were driven by something else entirely. I started noticing little things. Michael, who used to only pop by the office occasionally, started showing up every day. He'd sit in on meetings he had no business being in, asking questions about our finances and future projects, questions he was in no position to ask. He'd bring up his ideas more frequently, suggestions about cutting costs, reducing our design team's hours, and focusing less on the creative side and more on the business side. Each time I politely disagreed, but the more he pushed, the more I felt that these were not just casual suggestions. He wasn't interested in making the business better. He was interested in taking it over. One afternoon, as I was preparing for a meeting with a potential new client, I overheard a conversation between James and Michael in the hallway. They thought I was in my office, busy with paperwork, but I could hear every word. "She's not going to like this, James," Michael was saying. "But we need to do this. You know we do. She's too attached to her methods. We need someone who can make the tough calls." "I know," James replied, "but we have to be careful. She's worked so hard for this, and I don't want her to think we're taking it away from her. But if we want to grow, we need to move forward. We need to bring in someone who knows how to run things, someone who can make it profitable, not just creative." I froze, the words hanging in the air like a thick fog. They were talking about me, about my business. James, my husband, the man I trusted above anyone else, was agreeing to have Michael take control of Reed Designs. It wasn't just about helping out anymore. This was about taking over. I felt sick to my stomach. How had I not seen this coming? Had I been so blinded by my love for James that I ignored all the signs? My mind raced as I processed what I'd just overheard. They were talking about changing everything, about taking my company from me. It was no longer just a suggestion, it was a plan in motion. That evening I confronted James. "Are you trying to take my business away from me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper as the weight of the question settled between us. His face went pale, and for a moment I thought he might deny it, but instead he just looked at me, guilt in his eyes. I I didn't want it to come to this, Allison, he said, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite place. But we've been struggling to stay competitive, and Michael, he has a lot of ideas. He can help us grow. Maybe it's time for you to step back a little. You've done so much, but— But what? I interrupted, my heart pounding. What, James? You think I haven't tried to make this business successful? You think I don't know how to grow reed designs? I'm not saying that, he replied quickly, holding up his hands. But maybe it's time to consider what's best for the future. You've been working nonstop, and I think Michael could bring in the right kind of strategy. This could be what we need. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. What we need. You and Michael think you know what's best for the business I built? The one I've worked every day to make a success? James looked down, avoiding my eyes, and I knew then that my suspicions had been right all along. He wasn't just going along with Michael's ideas for the company. He was buying into them. He was actively trying to convince me to step aside, to let go of everything I had worked for. And worst of all, he was using our relationship to manipulate me. I need some time to think, I said, my voice steady, though my insides were in turmoil. I need to figure out what's really going on here, James, but I'm not going to let you and Michael tear this business apart. I walked away from him, knowing that nothing would ever be the same. My husband, the man who had promised to support me through everything, had now become someone I couldn't trust. And Michael? He was no longer just James's brother. He was a threat to everything I had built. That night, I stayed up late, running through every conversation I'd had with them, every decision they'd suggested. I knew I had to protect Reed Designs, but I also knew that if I confronted them too soon, I might lose my edge. They'd think I was reacting out of fear or anger. I had to be smarter than that. I had to outplay them at their own game. As I sat there, the weight of everything bearing down on me, one thing became clear. I wasn't going to let them take my business. Not without a fight. I was going to take control of this situation, and I would outsmart them both. But I needed a plan. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I couldn't let my emotions dictate my actions, so I focused on gathering information. First, I began monitoring every conversation between James and Michael more closely. I noticed how they would linger over certain topics when they thought I wasn't paying attention, especially when it came to the financials and the future direction of the business. They seemed to be pushing for changes that would only benefit them. Things like cutting back on the design team, shifting our focus to more profitable but less creative projects, and most suspicious of all, restructuring the company to give Michael a controlling role. I had to admit, this wasn't just a casual takeover. It was a well-thought-out plan. But instead of confronting them directly, I decided to take a more calculated approach. I knew I couldn't act too quickly, or they'd see it as a reaction to their moves. I needed to stay calm, poised, and most importantly, informed. I pulled out every document I could find on the business's financials, our contracts, recent invoices, and most importantly, any legal agreements regarding company ownership. I also began consulting with a lawyer I had worked with in the past, just to get a sense of my rights and options. If they were going to try and wrest control away from me, I needed to know exactly what legal grounds I stood on. Then came the discovery that made everything fall into place. One afternoon, I was reviewing some project budgets when I noticed a strange pattern in the expenses. Several invoices had been paid to a consultant Michael had recommended, someone who had never been a part of our team and had no real experience in design. The invoices were substantial, and the consultants' fees seemed to be tied to tasks I had never authorized. It wasn't just a coincidence. Michael had been funneling money out of the business, lining his own pockets while pretending to help with restructuring. My blood ran cold as I realized they were draining the resources I had worked so hard to build. I knew what I had to do next. I began collecting evidence, every email, every contract, and every suspicious transaction. But I didn't stop there. I started subtly making changes in the business to protect my assets. I locked down some of the more sensitive accounts, changed passwords, and ensured that any new contracts I signed would protect my position in the company. I also made sure that my team knew what was going on without alarming them. Some of them had noticed the tension between James and me, but I didn't want them to feel like they were caught in the middle. It wasn't easy, but I had to think of the long term. Then came the confrontation. I decided it was time to put my plan into motion. I asked James to meet with me at the office one evening after hours, under the guise of discussing some new business opportunities. When he arrived, I started casually asking about some of the recent meetings he'd had with Michael. I could tell he was getting nervous, shifting in his seat as I prodded for more details. But it wasn't until I slid the stack of evidence across the desk, financial records, suspicious consultant invoices, emails between Michael and some outside investors, that his facade cracked. He stared at the documents in silence for a long moment before finally looking up at me, his face pale. "James, I've been more than patient," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But this isn't a misunderstanding anymore. I know what you and Michael have been planning. You've been siphoning money from the company, setting things up so Michael can take control while pretending it's all for the good of Reed Designs. You thought I wouldn't find out, but I did." He didn't respond at first, his eyes darting to the evidence I had laid out. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Allison, I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I was doing what was best for the company. Michael and I both agreed that this was the only way to keep things going." "You thought you were doing what was best?" I cut him off, my anger rising. "You've been undermining me for months, pretending to help, while planning to take everything I built. This company isn't just some business venture, James. This is my life's work, and you let Michael, your own brother, destroy it." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. The silence between us was thick, and I could feel the betrayal weighing heavily on him. I didn't want to keep doing this, didn't want to drag him through the mess of our personal lives, but I had no choice. "You've already gone too far," I said, my voice unwavering. "But it's not too late to fix this. Michael isn't taking over, and neither are you. I'm taking control of this company, and you're going to fix this mess before I take legal action, and trust me, I will." James didn't speak, but his eyes told me everything. He knew I wasn't bluffing. And while the confrontation wasn't easy, it felt like the first real step in taking back what was mine. I didn't know what the future held, but I was ready to fight for Reed Designs. No one, least of all my own family, was going to take it from me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. James and Michael weren't going to go down without a fight, but neither was I. This business was my blood, sweat, and tears, and I wasn't about to let them take it from me without a fight. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions and careful strategy. I could tell that James was shaken by our confrontation, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. There was a tension in the air, something palpable between us. He avoided talking to me directly, but his actions spoke louder than words. He started showing up at the office more frequently, having long, private discussions with Michael behind closed doors, no doubt trying to figure out how they could salvage their plan. I could see the wheels turning in their heads. They weren't going to give up easily, and I needed to stay one step ahead of them. But I wasn't about to back down. The night after our confrontation, I spent hours reviewing every legal document I had on the business. I checked our ownership structure, the terms of our contracts with clients, and any clauses that could give me leverage. I contacted my lawyer again, this time with a clear purpose, to begin preparing for what might come next. If they pushed this any further, I wanted to make sure I was in the strongest position possible to defend myself. I also made some changes to the company's financial accounts, tightening up security and ensuring that no unauthorized transactions could go through without my approval. I started reaching out to my trusted advisors, people who had supported me in building Reed Designs, to see if they had any insight on how to handle a situation like this. One of them suggested I take a more aggressive stance with Michael, showing him that I wasn't just going to roll over. It wasn't about being vindictive. It was about asserting my rights, my authority. If they thought they could walk all over me, they were mistaken. I had worked too hard for this business to let them dismantle it for their own gain. A week later, James finally reached out to me. He asked to meet again, this time in a neutral location, outside the office. My first instinct was to refuse. After everything that had happened, I didn't want to meet him anywhere that wasn't in a professional setting, but I knew I needed to hear him out. I agreed, but only on the condition that we meet at a cafe where I knew I'd be comfortable, with no distractions. I needed to hear the full extent of what he had to say, and I knew that would give me an opportunity to observe his true intentions. When we met, James seemed less confident than before. He looked tired, as if the weight of the past week had taken its toll on him. He didn't even look me in the eye as he started speaking, his words slow and measured. "Allison, I've been thinking," he began, "about what you said last week. I never meant for things to get out of hand like this. Michael and I just wanted what was best for the business, but I can see now that I might have gone about it the wrong way." I listened closely, trying to gauge whether this was genuine remorse or just another attempt to regain control of the situation. James had always been good at playing the victim when things got tough, but I wasn't about to let him manipulate me again. "I understand that you want what's best for the company," I said carefully, "but what you and Michael tried to do wasn't just about helping Reed Designs. It was about taking it from me. You wanted to push me out, and that's not something I can forgive. If you want to fix this, you need to show me that you're committed to making things right." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He clearly wasn't expecting my directness. He had probably hoped that this meeting would be a way for him to ease back into the business, to smooth things over with some empty words, but I wasn't interested in empty promises. "I'm willing to work through this," James said, his voice almost pleading. "I know I made a mistake, and I'm sorry. I can't undo what happened, but I want to make things right." I took a deep breath. The temptation to believe him, to think that maybe, just maybe, he could be genuine, was strong. But I couldn't afford to let my emotions cloud my judgment. Too much was at stake. "I'll need more than just words, James," I replied. "If you really want to make things right, then show me. Show me that you can respect my role here, that you can support me, not just for the business, but for us. Because this isn't just about Reed Designs anymore. It's about trust, and right now, I don't trust you." The silence that followed was heavy. James sat back in his chair, his eyes finally meeting mine. For a moment, I thought he might argue, but instead he just nodded. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Just give me a chance." I wasn't sure if I believed him, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't afford to back down. I needed to be stronger than ever, smarter than ever, and more prepared than ever. This wasn't just about saving my business. It was about saving myself from the people who tried to take everything I worked for, and I wasn't about to let them win. The days that followed were tense but strategic. James seemed genuinely committed to making amends, or at least he was doing a good job of pretending. He started showing up at the office more, trying to ease back into the fold. He'd ask about projects, express interest in the team's progress, and even started making small talk with employees, but I could see through the act. He wasn't doing it because he genuinely cared about the business anymore. He was doing it to regain some sense of control. The facade was thin, and I wasn't buying it. I needed more than just his presence at the office. I needed him to prove he could be a partner again, but the damage had already been done. Meanwhile, Michael wasn't backing off either. He continued to hang around the office, often loitering in the hallways or sitting in on meetings where his presence was unnecessary. It became clear that he wasn't ready to give up his ambitions. He still believed he could take over, that he could run Reed Designs better than I ever could. The fact that James was trying to smooth things over didn't deter him. In fact, it seemed to embolden him. I started to feel the weight of it all. Two people, both of whom I trusted, trying to destroy what I had built. I couldn't let it happen. It wasn't until one evening, while reviewing some client contracts, that I stumbled across something I hadn't expected. I noticed a set of financial documents on my desk that had been printed out but were out of place. They looked like new partnership offers, and the details inside were unsettling. These documents were agreements for new ventures, new investors that I had never approved, and more importantly, they were under Michael's name, not mine. I stared at the papers in disbelief. They were clearly drafted with the intention of presenting them to potential backers without my involvement. Michael had been trying to forge partnerships, ones that would give him the upper hand, bypassing my authority entirely. He was moving forward with the takeover, making deals behind my back as if I was already out of the picture. My heart raced as I absorbed the magnitude of what I was seeing. I knew then that I couldn't just sit back anymore. James had shown signs of regret, but Michael was in this for himself. He wouldn't stop until he had control, and it was becoming clear that my business wasn't just at risk from their plans, it was actively being undermined. I couldn't trust them to back off on their own. I had to make my move. I reached out to my lawyer again, and this time, I laid everything out for her. The false contracts, the questionable invoices, the underhanded deals. I explained everything I had discovered, and she didn't hesitate for a moment. We began preparing for action, drafting legal paperwork that would allow me to assert my rights over Reed Designs once and for all. If James and Michael were trying to dismantle my business, I had the legal tools to stop them. It wasn't just about protecting my company, it was about protecting my legacy, my hard work, my identity. By the time I was ready to confront them, I had everything in place. I knew what steps I had to take to defend myself and my business, but I also knew it wouldn't be easy. They would fight back, and they'd try to make me doubt myself again. But this time, I wasn't going to be caught off guard. This time, I was ready. I called another meeting. This time, it wasn't just about listening to their excuses or giving them a chance to explain themselves. This was the moment where everything would come to light. They had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. As I walked into the office that day, a sense of calm washed over me. I knew what needed to be done, and I knew I had the power to stop them. The betrayal they had planned, the way they tried to take what I built, it ended today. I called James and Michael into the office for one last meeting. It was time to end this one way or another. As they walked in, I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They both knew something was different about this meeting. James, usually the one who would try to calm the situation, was unusually quiet. Michael, on the other hand, still wore that arrogant expression, as if he hadn't learned anything from the past few weeks. But this time, I wasn't going to play along. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into thinking they had any more power over me. I placed the stack of documents on the table between us. Contracts, invoices, emails, proof of every underhanded move they had made to take my company from me. I watched their faces as they realized what I was about to do. Michael's confident smirk faltered first, and James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I know everything," I said, my voice steady. "The deals you've been making behind my back, the investments you've been lining up in Michael's name, the way you've been trying to slowly phase me out of my own business. I have all of it documented. This ends now." James finally spoke, his voice strained. "Allison, you don't understand. We were trying to help the business. Michael has ideas that could make us more profitable. I thought we were on the same team." His words felt empty, like they were meant to placate me, but I wasn't buying it anymore. "Help? You've been trying to take it from me, James. I built this company. I've been the one running it, fighting for it every single day. You don't get to just take it over because you think you know better." Michael sat back in his chair, his face flushed with frustration. "You don't get it. This was never about hurting you, Allison. You're too focused on the details. We were trying to make it more efficient, more successful. It was never personal." His words felt like an insult. How could they think they were in the right when everything they did was behind my back? "This is personal, Michael. This is my life's work. I'm not going to let you and James tear it apart for your own gain." The tension in the room was suffocating, but I stood my ground. I had the evidence, the legal backup, and the support of people who had been behind me from the start. This wasn't just a fight for Reed Designs, it was a fight for my dignity and my future. I looked them both in the eye, my voice unwavering. "You've crossed a line. I'm taking legal action, and you're both going to pay for what you've done." James's expression shifted from defensive to regretful, but it was too late. "Allison, please," he said, his voice pleading. I didn't mean for it to go this far. But it was clear now. He had allowed Michael to drag him into this scheme, and he was only now realizing the depth of the mess they had created. I shook my head. "It's too late for apologies. I gave you a chance to fix this, and you didn't. Now, you'll have to deal with the consequences." The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, but in the end, the outcome was clear. Reed Designs was mine. I retained full ownership, and James and Michael were both removed from any decision-making roles within the company. Michael's deals with outside investors were nullified, and any financial damage he had caused was reversed. It was a painful victory, but one that felt earned. I was able to restore my business and reclaim my authority, something I had feared I would lose forever. James and I spoke a few times after everything had settled, but it was never the same. The trust was broken, and although he apologized, I couldn't forget what he had tried to do. I couldn't go back to the way things were, not after all that had happened. As for Michael, he left the city shortly after, likely to pursue his own interests elsewhere, away from the wreckage he helped cause. In the end, Reed Designs continued to grow, not just because of the business decisions I made, but because of the strength I had found in myself during one of the toughest times in my life. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but I also knew that I was stronger than I had ever realized. I had fought for my business, for my vision, and for my future, and no one was ever going to take that away from me again.